Hello, and welcome to Reducing Risk by Testing Every Change Where It Matters in Production. Today's webinar is sponsored by Split and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. And we'll have poll questions throughout the event, and we'd love to see your questions as they come in. If they're sort of right on topic, we might ask them as they come. So that Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio or video or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Next, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. We have a ton of great links from Split today. There are links to book a demo, best practices for feature flags, guides to implementing testing in production, the Split admin APIs, and other resources about testing in production. So check those out. A lot of great stuff there. You can also find a link to the Actual Tech Media Guerrilla Guide Book Club and a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming webinars. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section as well. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenter. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Ariel Perez, who is Vice President of Engineering for Measurement and Experimentation at Split. Ariel, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for having me. Hopefully, you'll all get something out of this, and that you'll find this content engaging.
I'm looking forward to it. Let's go.
Amazing, awesome. So, my name is Ariel Perez. Again, I'm the VP of Engineering for Measurement and Experimentation at Split Software. We're a feature flagging and feature management and experimentation company. I'll start with a little bit about myself before we dive in. Just my history before this, I've bounced around between large organizations, Fortune 50 banks, and Fortune 50 companies, and small startups, including running my own startup and consulting with companies. So I've run the gamut between size and scale of problems that we've looked at, while also done everything from individual contributorship to managing large engineering teams. And in the middle of that, actually also leading product. So I've looked at this from every direction. And one thing that I've learned all the way through in all my experiences is that the power that comes from testing in production and why we want to harness it. So on the agenda, we're going to go through a brief review of feature flags, what they are, just catching everyone up again on what feature flags are. Then we'll dive into why pre-production testing is not enough. We'll go through a definition of what is testing in production and how we think about it. Then we'll go through a few examples of testing with feature flags. We'll talk about alpha and beta programs and the power of feature flags plus data. So first, a brief review of feature flags. So feature flags, also known as feature toggles or feature switches. In its basic form, it's literally an on or off switch, allowing you to toggle and control between version A or version B. In the code, it simply looks like an if-else statement. And this is the most basic form of implementing feature flags. Here, to get shipping options, if the overnight shipping feature flag is on, we're going to add the overnight option to the results for shipping options. If not, we're not going to have overnight as an option. So then The beauty of how we do it with Split or a feature flagging platform on the other side of it is that we're able to control it remotely by Split. So within Split, we enable targeting rules to determine who in particular can see on or off. And that creates immense power and the capability to remotely manage and enable which particular users see on and which particular users see off. And we'll jump, into all the different ways that enables us to extensively test in production while reducing risk. So first, before going into that, the first question I'd like to ask, and if we can bring up the poll, is how many of you are confident that your staging environment matches your production environment?
Okay, great. So yeah, we have this poll up here, and if everybody could just answer yes or no in terms of if you're confident, then answer yes, and if you're not confident that they resemble each other closely enough, please answer no. So we've got answers rolling in here, and it looks like we'll show you the results here in a minute, the percentage results. But right now it's sort of neck and neck. So every vote counts at this point.
And great, we can go into the next slide while we tally those results, right? And I'll talk through that, and then we'll see the results after the fact.
Yeah, well, here they are. Yeah, unfortunately,
Okay,
if we
awesome.
skip to a different slide, it'll end. But yeah, let me get.
Sorry about that.
Yep. No,
okay,
no
so 56% of you feel that your staging environment closely resembles production. Hope we'll see if that changes when we go through this next set of slides, right?
Okay. Up, and I skipped back through your. Yeah, there we go. Sorry.
Yep. And we're going to be here now. Cool. So the first thing is that staging does not equal production, and that's one of the major reasons why pre-production testing is not enough. Not saying that we don't have to do it, and we'll talk about that as well, but it's not enough. And what are the reasons why staging is not like production? Well, one of the things is the breadth and depth of staging. It's not set up the same way. We often have smaller clusters in staging. We often have less of our services, whether it's external services, internal services, supporting services, running in staging. And because of that, we often have very different configurations for the things we point to and don't point to. Obviously, this is not because we don't want to do this, right? Many times it's primarily driven by the cost of maintaining a staging environment that's exactly like production. We aim for something like production, but it's very hard to actually achieve it. So cost is a big driver. Often complexity is a big driver in terms of how we manage all the dependencies and having exact services and downstreams of production. But lastly, especially for those of us that are using more microservices and are less monolithic, and that can happen when you're early on in our careers and our stages of our company of a particular piece of software. It might be a lot more monolithic, but as we progress down that maturity curve, we tend to drive down toward the microservice implementation, and it's almost impossible to maintain the exact same configuration, setup, and installation and versions of every microservice in staging as in prod. The next reason why staging is not like prod is that user behaviors are different. You're going to have less users in staging than you are in production. Even with load testing and performance testing, you're going to have less users than you'll have in production. Those users will also be going through a lot less scenarios unless we're going through an extensive amount of work to actually replicate all the scenarios that users go through in production. You're never going to have all the same scenarios that you have in production. Lastly, particularly on one part because of the different configurations and setup, but also the different way users use the system, we're not going to be able to replicate the exact same interactions, where in production you might find a lot more complex interactions and users will use your system in ways you did not even imagine. Lastly, monitoring. Monitoring is very different in your staging environment. Your signals differ. Your thresholds for what might issue an alert will be different in staging than in production. Because of the way you're able to load and test and hit staging, certain signals will never even be emitted, so your alerts will never even fire. And sorry, there's an item there that was supposed to be deleted. So these are all the ways why staging is not like production. Now, for those of you who said that you feel 56% of you that felt confident that staging is like production, I'd be interested in understanding, do you still feel the same way? Or have you maybe adjusted your thinking on how close staging is to production? And I'd be happy to see those results in the chat.
Okay.
So
Oh, gotcha.
actually,
Sorry.
you know what? Let's redo the poll now. As a matter of fact, that's great. Let's
Yeah,
you
just
read my
let's
mind.
ask the question again, see how it comes out. All right.
Okay, seems to be evening out, but it's dropped a little bit now. Now it's more closer to 50-50.
Yep.
Okay,
Super.
amazing. Let's jump back in and continue and talk about that some more.
Okay.
Okay, so first I'm going to start with a quote. And this is a quote from Cindy Sridharan. She wrote an amazing set of articles on Medium a few years ago, testing in production the safe way. And the safe way was actually, I think, her fourth in that series. And this quote captures it perfectly, right? None of this is meant to suggest that maintaining a staging environment is completely useless. Only that, as often as not, it's relied upon to a much greater degree than necessarily needed, to the point where at many organizations, it still remains the only form of testing that happens before a full production rollout. The challenge with that is, as I mentioned before, right, production is the only time, and actually the first time, your system will actually be tested by your users. And it's because of that it's very important to figure out how do we harness that power of production? How do we harness the ability to finally face customers so the first time and get the value out of that and learn from that, but do it and do it safely to really ensure that we've really tested everything. So, um, what is testing in production? And before I go into what is testing in production, I'd actually like to go to a poll now. It's how many of you are testing in production?
Okay. Yeah, so we've got that poll up there. It's a simple one. Do you currently test in production? Yes or no? So we'll just leave that one and love to hear. Okay, answers are starting to come in. Thanks everybody for answering. And um, and Ariel, this is looking already like a pretty similar split to the last
The
answer.
previous one.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think maybe
So
people who
interesting.
are confident in how close their staging environment is to their production environment are maybe testing in production. Um,
And
and
interesting.
everybody else wants
I'd
to hear more
expect the
about it.
inverse.
Yeah,
Often enough, you finally see the inverse. Like people who are actually, confident in their staging environment feel less of a need to test in production, but also might not
yeah,
just be about need, right? There's also this
yeah.
question about comfort with testing in production.
All
Okay.
right.
So
Well,
it
we're
seems we
right
ended
at
up at about
50-50.
50-50.
Amazing.
Okay.
That is an
So
even split. Okay, so
awesome.
I'll take you back to
So
that quote or
sounds good. So
breakdown.
here's the interesting thing, right? Um, whether we want to or not, whether we like to or not, or whether we're even trying to or not, we're all testing in production, right? Once the system is in production, we're going to run into things that we never covered in our lower environments, and we're exercising for the first time ever. So because of that, we're all testing in production. It's the same example if you start thinking about, any product company, and this is why you often see so many product recalls. Any product company has gone through immense and intense rounds of testing, but it's only when it gets out in front of customers, whether it's a car, whether it's a washing machine, that you really actually test it in all the different ways that you might have never intended or thought of. And then because of that is when you often end up with recalls. So you're always testing in production, and the idea is like, how do we actually get better at doing so? So testing in production has always gotten a bad rap, right? And this meme, will take us back for the last 10 years or so. It's I don't always test my code, but when I do it in production, right? And that's not what I'm referring to, and it's not what I'm referring to at all. Um, what I want to get to instead is start thinking about is no, I always test my code, then I test it again in production, and we're going to talk through again how we do that. But I actually want to take one more slight nuance on that. I'm not just testing my code, and this is the key difference about production. I'm testing my system. And the thing is that none of our code lives in isolation. And especially when we put it in production, it's pretty much the first time that all the interconnections and all the dependencies, and it's basically the first time that's ever truly integrated into a system. And systems have emergent properties that are very, very hard to guess at early on, but also think about and reason about in a very, very directed fashion. So the fact that it's the first time we'll ever see these behaviors occur in production is why we have to get really good at practicing testing in production. So production has three distinct stages. And we'll break those down, especially when it comes to releasing features and putting features in production. So the first part is the deployment, the actual physical act of taking your code and putting it into the production environment. Installation, right? Putting your code in prod. In the past, putting your code in prod meant releasing as well. Thankfully, with tools that we have today and we've built out, those two things aren't necessarily the same thing anymore. And we can harness that. Then there's the release. And the release part is enabling the particular code that you've put in production to your users. And again, we've gotten really good at the idea of releasing. We have so many mechanisms for releasing and doing so in a very, very safe fashion. And the last part of this is this, once it's in production, this is post-release, there's so much other testing that we can do and continuously do, because one thing that happens with production systems is that over time, they end up degrading. It's because they're getting hit by real users, real systems, and they're going to fail in all different kinds of ways. So our job is to make sure that we can get really good at understanding what's happening, how they fail, so we continually test these things. So when it comes to deployment, there are many, many different ways to test in production. There are things like integration tests. And again, you can do integration tests and staging, but as I said before, production is the first time that you actually have everything integrated. So you can run integration tests. You can run tap compare tests, and I'll dive into those in a bit later on. You can run load tests there. You can do shadowing, where you drive some of your traffic into a copy of production or down into a lower environment. Configuration tests, which are extremely important, especially when you start thinking about that lower environment configurations are different from upper environment configurations, and dark launches. When it comes to releasing, we have things like canarying, right? Just like a canary in a coal mine was the thing that allowed coal miners to really figure out, is there going to be a problem? Is an early signal on whether there was low oxygen? You can start canarying your releases to a subset of users. Monitoring is extremely important here. This is where you start understanding how your release is going. Traffic shaping, where you start sending some traffic to some places and not others. Feature flagging. Now, interestingly enough, we're going to be talking about how you can use feature flagging to cover many of these use cases. But feature flagging is a technique that you use when releasing. And exception tracking, right? Systems like Sentry allow you to understand all the exceptions that are sent to there and dive into them to understand what kind of stack traces you get. And lastly, post-release. There's so many different things you do post-release. Teeing is the ability to take a particular set of issues in production and route them to a lower environment where your debugging might be enabled at a higher threshold. So you can reproduce the exact issue and then debug it more deeply than you can in prod. Profiling, logging in events, chaos testing, something that Amazon and AWS pioneered with their Chaos Monkey and later on Chaos Gorilla. More monitoring and continuous monitoring. This is where you actually now start doing AVN testing and start figuring out whether one thing works better than another. Tracing and distributed tracing, dynamic exploration, real user monitoring, understanding exactly how your users are behaving, what they're doing, how you're using the system, and what impact is that having on the system. You can create synthetic users in production and start running synthetic users that you control in your test environment, and you dedicate a test through the production environment, and then auditing of basically what's happening, what's gone on in the system. So now that we've gone to this one, my next question will be, what are all the different ways that you're testing in production? I'd love to see that poll next.
Okay, so there it is. It's up there. So we've got dog fooding, alpha testing, beta testing, controlled rollouts, and none of the above. So we'll just leave that poll up there for a second. Answer as many of those as are appropriate in your environment. And responses are starting to roll in. And, Ariel, while we're waiting on those responses, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference between feature flags and canaries.
Yeah, so canaries are a technique for testing, right? So most of the time when it depends on who you're talking about from which context. So for example, when we take deployment orchestration tools and tools that do continuous delivery and continuous deployment, they'll talk about canaries from the perspective of actually putting the software artifact in production and only putting it in a small number of systems. So one example might be that if you have a fleet of services and you have, let's say, 10 instances in production, a canary would be, from that perspective, taking one of those particular, only installing on one of those instances, and then only routing traffic for some users to that instance. That's how you achieve a canary in the traditional sense when it comes to deployments. Now, with feature flags in particular, you can also achieve canaries, but on a much more granular level. And I'll dive into that some more when we get to the next set of slides. So, great question. We'll talk about how we do that with feature flags in particular.
Sounds great. Well, I think the responses have solidified here. So let's go ahead and go to the results slide. What do you think of what you're seeing here?
Yeah, actually, I think it actually, it looks really great. It's showing a more solid approach for the latter ones. Now, here's the interesting thing. Um, and again, for a second, 41% doing none of the above. We'll talk about how we help you get to these things, these practices. So the first thing, we're seeing that more people using beta testing, which is actually, I think very positive to see that, and people using controlled rollouts. The interesting thing is, not as many seeing alpha testing and dog fooding. And those are some of the places where you really want to actually add more of your testing to catch things early on. Dog fooding is when your own team, the own people working on this software, start using the software, right? You dog food the software. And then alpha testing is, and I'll dive into this some more in the next slides, is when your own internal team and internal users are using the product.
Okay.
So great, good to see this. Hopefully after this, we can start getting some of these numbers up. So the first thing I'll talk about is, how do we do these different kinds of all these different testing strategies, but how do we implement them with the use of feature flags in particular? Because with feature flags, you can actually get to many of these capabilities. So interestingly enough, and I'll talk through what it shows here. I'll highlight the specific ones that, even though they look like separate testing strategies, in reality, we can actually achieve most of these, if not all of these, through the use of feature flags. I'm not going to go through all of them, but as we go through some of these, we'll show some examples on how feature flags enable you to actually do some of these kinds of testing. So back to how we test with feature flags. So the secret sauce is this, and thankfully many of you are using controlled rollouts. It's a percentage rollout. The ability to control what percentage of your users will see your feature. That's the secret sauce to many of the ways that we test in production. So then with that, we're going to talk next about, how do we do this and how do we do it safely is you use these feature flags and that percentage capability to actually achieve progressive delivery. And what is progressive delivery? It's rolling out to an increasingly larger impact radius. You start with just your dev team, right? And just the people who are working on this thing when you first put this in production to really understand how, did it have the impact you expected? Is it working, as you intended it to? You expand that potentially to your QA team so that your QA team can actually now deliberately test in production, run through their test scripts, and take a harder look at it in your real environment. This is when you start going now to an alpha stage. And so the previous two are more about dog fooding. The alpha stage is toward the end of dog fooding, but it's more deliberate. You start getting people outside of the team that worked on it to start looking at this and testing it and interacting with it. When you pass that phase, you start getting to a more dedicated beta phase. And later on, I'll talk about how you can set up some beta programs. But beta is your first set of real customers, real users who opt in to see features that are not fully baked. And the importance there is they understand that they're not fully baked and they might get some errors, but they get a sneak peek at features and help drive the roadmap. After that, you start expanding to larger and larger waves of users, 5% of users. You start debugging, trying to figure out issues. Are there any errors? And then you go out gradually out to 50% of users, and everything goes fine to everyone. Now, there are many, many different ways that you can achieve these things, but one of the important things is that the feature flag and control rollout allows you to roll it out slowly. But then on top of that is how you then understand impact and what systems and tools are you looking at that help you understand the impact. There is where a suite of tools and suite of capabilities and practices really help. So I'm going to first start with the first use case, and becomes almost the baseline for everything you do when you're testing in production with feature flags. The first one is dark launches. And what is a dark launch? It's deploying new features without enabling them for customers. So this is usually your first step. You put your code in production and it's at 0%. Now, why would you do this? Well, it's to see if anything happens with your infrastructure, even with it in zero, when you first position it out there. You can start testing and playing with the particular software without any user seeing it yet. And the key thing, not without any users seeing it, it means that you can start enabling it just for yourselves. And internally, you can start monitoring for any blips and errors, any increases in latency and throughput. You can start looking at your system metrics and see if anything is off that you did not expect. The next tactic that you start thinking about is now, canary releases, which was brought up before. And this is starting to roll out features to a subset of users to start assessing the reaction of the overall system. As you start doing the canary release, before you had everything was V1 for your feature. Then as you start doing your canary release, more and more percentages of your users and actually targeted users start seeing version V2 until eventually when you're completely satisfied, and this is when you finish the progressive delivery cycle, you get everyone is on V2. The importance about canary releases is for you to start setting up your monitoring dashboards. You start looking at your favorite monitoring tools and monitoring stack and seeing that every time you roll out, you see any impacts. You also start looking potentially at your product analytics tool and start seeing our customer behaviors any different for that first percentage that you started rolling out to. Next, the other kind of thing that this is one of the first times that you can actually do this when you're in production is configuration testing. So configuration testing is testing with multiple combinations of software and hardware in order to evaluate the functional requirements and find out the optimal configuration. I think as many of you potentially have gotten, battle scars from the past of, the database configuration was different in production. Maybe we have issues with the threading and things at the OS level, things at the database level, things at the application level. Sometimes the JVMs have different configuration parameters in production. Feature flagging, especially with the capability that we have at Split, which is dynamic configurations and the ability to dynamically change these from the UI, allows you to then test different combinations of configuration in production with canary releases, with dark launches, and seeing what is the optimal setting in production for you. So it allows you to do this stuff safely and do it quickly. Next, I'd like to introduce a particular approach called tap compare test, and I wanted to dive into this specifically. So a tap compare test is testing the behavior and performance of the new version by comparing the results against the old version. Often you do this in the example of this slide here that I got from another article is, often you'll send to, version 1 of a service and it'll respond with, just the payload, my name is Alex. And then you go to service 2. And here the payload says full name Alex. Obviously, if that's a change that you did not expect, then it's going to be a problem. So how can you do this with feature flags and implement it in your code and use a tool like Split to help you? Sorry, did it just jump to the poll?
No, it didn't.
Okay, I'm seeing the poll somehow. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it didn't. It went to. Sorry, let me go back there. Okay. Do you see the tap compare test slide?
Yep. Okay.
Great.
So in code, what does this look like? So whenever you have your feature flag, and again, I cut out a bunch of parts of code, but the important part is this, that if the feature flag is saying, and we use this internally ourselves at Split for migrating from Mongo over to S3 for a particular implementation. So the first one says, if it's MongoDB, then get your result from Mongo. If we're doing Mongo and comparing, get your result from Mongo, but also try to get the result from S3 and then compare the two. And if the two are different, and it's up to you to implement your logic on what does different mean, if the two are different, that's when you either log a warning that the results are different, or you can even emit events and tracking events to a system. And we'll talk about later on how Split really helps you see this when they're different. And you can do this also for the other side of it is if it says S3, get the results from S3. If it says S3 compare, get the results from S3 and Mongo and compare them. So a tap compare test allows you to route traffic to your new implementations, often means a downstream provider. Could be another microservice, could be an API, could be a database, could be Kafka. And actually we did that for Kafka and Kinesis. And you want to compare, are the results different to each other? So all of these can be done just with feature flags. And feature flags will take you a very long way, right? Just with that controlled rollout, there's so many different capabilities that you can implement. just using feature flags, but this means then that you're looking somewhere else. You're monitoring, as I said before, you're looking at logs, you're looking at your observability stack, you're looking at your product analytics tools. You're trying to find all these other places to say, when I change the feature flag here and I can change the rollout, does something over there change? But you can get a lot more value when you actually mix feature flags with data, and that's one of the things that Split helps you do. They help you figure out which particular feature flags are having actual impacts and impacts on which metrics. And that's the key thing, and that's the secret sauce of Split. We actually give you direct attribution, and we apply statistical significance and experimental analysis to any rollout that you might implement, as long as you feed in the data. So what does that look like in Split? So one of the things you can do is you can monitor and alert with Split. Many of you have all kinds of tools. You might be using App Dynamics, you might be using Dynatrace, Datadog, Signal Effects, a plethora of tools, actually Prometheus, in your observability stack. But one of the beauties of doing your monitoring and alerting within Split is that Split in particular can continuously compare your feature flags and performance data to find anomalies. And more specifically, it links those anomalies to the new features and it can find causality. So when you feed in your feature flag data and your error data and your performance data into Split, we can then alert on that. And what does an alert look like? We can tell you for a particular split, which is in this case a feature that you've rolled out and changed with a feature flag, we'll issue an alert and tell you, hey, this caused an alert in the last 5 minutes, and immediately give the ability to kill that feature if it's misbehaving. You can also see all the alerts that have fired for a feature over time. And in this case, as an example, saying, you know what, for this feature, we saw that your errors per user actually went up by a certain percentage, and we can tell you the absolute impact, and the page load time also went up, and your average cart size went down. So you show that you're actually monitoring performance, monitoring errors, and monitoring business metrics all within Split in one place, and it can attribute to that specific feature, which is a very powerful capability, because now you know where you can roll it back or you can need to kill it. The second thing that you can do with the feature flags and data when testing in production is experimentation, which is measuring the impact of every change and determining whether a version A, or B, or C, or D is actually driving the effects that you're looking for. So you can look here, and on the left, you'll find that we're trying to think about whether the current version or V1 or V2 has a higher impact on revenue per user, and Split can tell you that. These are things that you cannot test in a lower environment. In a lower environment, you have an idea of what might move. You might do research. You might do some testing on whether the feature you built is built right. So did you build the thing right? It's not until production, however, when you actually meet real users that you can confirm and test, did you build the right thing? And those are two very different things. A lot of pre-production testing is all about, did you build the thing right? And even when you talk about the deploy phase and the early parts of the release phase in production, it's all about, did I build the thing right? As we go forward and get into production testing against real users, and especially with experimentation, is, did we build the right thing? So the next thing here is an example of that is, I was running it, we were running an experiment internally within Split. Nobody's seen this yet, right? So you're the first to see this. And we're trying to, look at our metrics cards, which you saw on the previous screen. And we're trying to see whether we can actually have an impact on user engagement with metrics cards, and whether they actually interact with them more, or they can get the value of the cards immediately by seeing them by changing the style. So we were comparing one style where on the left, the idea was like, look, we're not sure if this will actually impact their behavior, but maybe they're just trying to understand if the particular impact was desired or undesired. On the other side, we're trying to compare, do they care more about the actual impact, the number, whether the number went down or went up? And just by the color, can we show whether it was desired or not? So stay tuned on this. You'll see more of the product coming out of this as we learn more from this particular experiment. Then there's one keynote that we cannot forget here, right? And here's the big part. Guardrails. Guardrails are one of the most important things you need in production when you have feature flags and data. And this is where the alerting is based off of, and this is where the experimentation really, really flies. And how do you think about good guardrails, right? When you put something in production, what are the things you always want to monitor and test and experiment on to ensure that they haven't gone the wrong way? You often break that between business metrics on one side and operational metrics on the other. So the business metrics, and those really depend on your business, right? Whether you're in e-commerce or financial services or healthcare, but some of these often apply to most of them. So one of them might be looking at your daily active users, weekly active, monthly active users, and whether this specific change impacted that and caused it to go up or down. You might be looking at average revenue per user, and that's something like, for example, Facebook looks at. Again, whether this specific feature, regardless of what it does and what you were intending to do, did it move your average revenue per user? In the e-commerce space, you might often be looking at average order value and average cart size. And in other places, especially in the mobile app space, you might be looking at things like 7, 14, or even monthly retention, right? What happens with users? Do they start dropping off after 7 days, 14 days, or a month? So these are the things that you want to, almost always monitor and track in any change you make as you go through your canary, as you start expanding, going upward, right? To make sure that you didn't impact your business negatively. On the other side, especially for engineers and for this group, there are things that we always want to look at and make sure that at the minimum for any change, did we build the thing right? That we can monitor these as well, regardless of what they're doing for the business. So, a good base to start from and which metrics you really want to track. You start with your rates, which in reality here is the question is basically your throughput. Has your request rate gone down, right? Have you reduced, have you somehow caused your ability to actually process less requests? You also start looking at your error rate. Somehow with this change, have your error rates gone up? Have you increased the number of errors, especially that customers are saying? And the last one is duration, or you can think about this latency. Have our requests gotten slower? 95% of the time, for any change you make, these are probably going to be the guardrails that you're going to want to be tracking and looking at very closely, whether you do them outside of Split and in your own monitoring dashboards, or even within Split, because Split can tell you and maintain that feature context and say, this specific feature caused duration to go up, which is very powerful as you start testing in production. And then lastly, I want to talk about a note on alpha and beta programs, right? These are extremely powerful ways to really gather feedback from your users, not only quantitative feedback, but actually qualitative feedback, right? And with alpha and beta programs, depending what business you're in, whether your business B2B or B2C, your beta program can start resembling more of a production release where you start getting a lot of quantitative data. But for many businesses, whether you're a small startup or even if you're B2B, your beta programs are a lot more about hand holding and working very closely with the users and getting a lot of qualitative feedback. So it's extremely important to really figure out when you can build these into the way you release things so you can get that feedback early and often before going out to general availability. So what does an alpha program look like? As a matter of fact, within Split, the idea is as simple as basically targeting a feature just to your internal users. So what happens here is that you can set up groups internally of set and segments, and it's powered by segments within Split. You set up a segment of internal users. Your internal users could be your customer success team. It could be your sales team. In some companies, your sales team really wants to get another look. It could be your marketing team. But you set up a group of users internally and you manage them throughout the UI. And you basically say, look, as the first thing I'm going to roll out to is within Split in the UI, I'm going to target this feature just to employees. So that one's actually a little bit easier. And you can manage that internally within your own company. The one that's harder, however, is setting up a beta program. Now, Split can help you do this, but there's a little more work that you do on your side of it, which is for a beta program, you can let your users opt in. This can potentially look like a UI, and you can create a form on your website or in your app that allows users to opt into the beta program. You can shoot them an email and say, hey, we'd like to invite you to the beta program. This is what it means. This is what you get out of it. You entice them for it. Sometimes people get rewards or other kinds of value out of it from the company. How you implement that with Split is you can actually hook that up to then do an API call into Split. And you start adding users into the beta segment so that then you can do the same thing as alpha and target those users. Here, I put in a curl request, an example of how you would do it. But basically, you can then build that beta program using Split and using Split's APIs. And that allows you to really harness the power of your users, usually who are the ones who are actually your biggest fans, and they'll start testing your software for you and give you a lot of feedback in production. The second part of the beta program that becomes very important is, again, depending on what kind of company you are, and if it's a high-touch company, you can then through your customer success team or your account managers really interact with those customers, solicit feedback, and really get a lot of information from them on how it's going for them. While on the other side of it, especially if you get a lot of customers and a lot of data and you're closer to the B2C world, again, looking at your monitoring stack, looking at your product analytics tools, but also looking at Split, you can actually see the exact impact on your metrics that matter from those users, and Split will alert you if there's a problem or if something goes off. Thank you, and that's it. So I would love to open more about to the group and understand your questions or particular things that didn't make sense there. Anything that you wanted to hear about that you didn't hear about.
Yeah, and excellent. And I've actually got some questions too because this is really interesting. So the first one I'm wondering is, how does Split itself work? Are you guys a cloud service, or is there software that's loaded, or is it you just put it directly into your code, in your development platform? How do you guys work?
Awesome. It's a combination of the above, right? So at its core, Split is a SaaS solution. We're fully cloud-based, and our attribution engine is all on the cloud. We have the management console, a UI that where you manage and set up your splits. But when it comes to your applications, a key thing about our architecture that is different from many other vendors and solution is that we give you an SDK that sits inside your application, and we have SDKs in dozens of languages, JavaScript, Swift, Kotlin, Java, Ruby, PHP. And our SDK sits inside your app. And the key thing about our SDK is that it is a rules engine. It doesn't phone home to try to get feature flag definition, to get feature flag settings and treatments. The only thing that it does at load up is figures out the rules that we gave it. Is this on for one person? Is it on for 10%? Is it on for users on iOS? It downloads those rules and then it's set up to run independently. So at that point, Split is running within your particular application. The second thing that's interesting about that particular architecture is the fact that you don't have to send us any data. So we don't ever capture PII when it comes to evaluating flags. So it increases the level of security and the protection of privacy, and it allows you to actually target on anything you want and use those attributes to target within your app on things that you might not want to share with us. So that's another key piece of our architecture with the SDKs.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that PII because that was another question that I had. So that's a great feature. So I've heard this koan about feature flags that the absence of failure doesn't mean that a feature is working. And so you talked a lot about telemetry and guardrails. What metrics should people track when they're testing in production? And then a follow up to that is, you mentioned some of those guardrails. Are those built into the platform? Are they easy to sort of plug and play, or do you need to kind of configure them, obviously to your own applications and things?
So, I think, and we can go back to the slide, right? Guardrails. So when you think about
Yeah, I'll
guardrails,
call that up.
the important part, when you think about what are the best candidates for guardrails, and I'm gonna start from the engineering side of things first, right? Especially for this crowd. Those are the things that that you never want to go wrong in production, regardless of what the feature is, right? Whether I'm just putting a brand new configuration change or I'm updating infrastructure, I want to make sure that these things don't go wrong. So, what things are those unusual? Like I said, a good baseline is red. Uh, has your throughput gone down, right? Usually, very rarely have I seen a feature that the goal is to make throughput go down, but that happens as well. But that's one guardrail. Has your throughput gone down? Can you actually service less requests and less customers? The other side of it is, have you increased errors? And that's a very quick thing that's a very important one to check when you talk about REST APIs, right? Have your 500 errors gone up? Have your 400 errors gone up? And you can actually set different alerts for those. Those are usually good indicators that something's not like the way it should. And the last one there being, duration, latency. Have you made things slower? Generally, those are the ones I would say to start as the core and the guardrails that you want to track for pretty much every change. Now, depending on your business, depending on your implementation, depending on what your particular solution is, there might be other technical things that you're looking at, right? When you have a mobile UI, a mobile app, the crash-free user rate is massive, right? You really want to maintain that crash-free user rate as high as possible for a mobile app. So you might want to track crashes and the amount of crashes that occur, instability. When it comes to other systems, you might want to start tracking, the increases in memory, right, and memory usage, CPU utilization. Those are much harder to get at a metric by metric level, and I'm sorry, and user by user level. But those are potentially things you want to track with every single change. Now, on the business side of things, again, this is very, very business specific, and you really want to, work on this with your business and your product partners. But almost always, you really don't want to impact your users. So that's why I mentioned before your daily active users, your weekly active users. If there's anything about this deployment and release that affects your active users, you want to track that and you want to know that immediately, independent of what it intended to do. You also want to track, like I said, things that identify revenue and are very closely tied to revenue, however your business is formed. You probably want to track that as well. And lastly, almost any app, right? Again, different businesses, um, track engagement in some way, shape, or form. And if you see a drop in engagement, a drop in interaction with the key features of your app, you're going to want to look into that more deeply. So I would say those are the key ones. If you're struggling to find which are your most important product features to track, I would say often try to start with your North Star. If you have a North Star, right, your top metric, and work backward from there and see what are the key metrics that your top engineering leads and engineering leadership is looking at regularly. You might want to look at what things in the business roundups and what your e-staff is talking about. Those are a good place to start and think about. We want to track these regardless of whatever change it is. Now going on the split side of things, how does split make this easy? So split split can help you as long as you feed data into it. And there's many different ways to feed data into it. So it all starts with first getting the data in. We have many different ways to get data in. One, with the Split SDK itself, you can actually emit track events, and you can emit those track events from anywhere in the infrastructure. It could be in your microservices, could be in your APIs, could be in your UI. So first, you can start with emitting from Split, and that'll immediately land within Split. If you have your data and telemetry coming from somewhere else, right, you might have your own behavioral analytics system. You might have your own systems for tracing and logging and capturing errors. You can always feed those into Split using APIs. So we have our own REST APIs that you can feed some of those events into Split. We also have actually a huge set of integrations, and actually, Emma, we can find one of the links on the integrations to make it much easier for you to actually send data to us when you're already capturing in other systems. Some of these are like from your product analytics tools. Some of these could be from your CDP. If you have a CDP, you can feed like from Segment or from mParticle. You can feed those into us. We have partners like Bugsnag and Datadog and other systems. So we have many different integrations that you can just set up on the UI to feed that telemetry into Split. Within Split, once that telemetry comes in, we have a metrics creator. And you can grab any of these events and say, what metric do I want to create? What matters to me? So for example, if I want to understand how many people are clicking on a button on a screen, because I'm running an experiment on that button and trying to increase engagement and interaction with that button, I can emit those events and I get those click events in Split, and I can create a metric that says, give me just the count. I want to know whether that count increased due to this feature. But you might look at things like averages, you might look at means, you might look at sums, you might look at just one value occurred and then another value occurred. So there are many different ways to set up these metrics. But that's it. Once you feed the data in and once you set up the metrics, one of the key things that differentiates Split from other providers is that we track all your metrics. So we help you find the anomalies that you did not expect. So once you've done that, you set up your metrics for your particular split, but we track everything else for you. You can create your guardrails in there. You can create your metrics for your partners and your peers and other areas. And Split will track and calculate all of them. And the thing that this helps you with often is finding that needle in the haystack where, hey, this all looks great. My feature's going awesome. All the operational metrics look great. All the product metrics look great. But oh my God, we're affecting this particular metric that is important to one other part of the company that we didn't even know we would affect, and now we're affecting it. And we help you find that. And that's a key thing that differentiates Split. We calculate all your metrics all the time and attribute them to every single feature.
That sounds really powerful. That's pretty awesome. The next question I had for you here came from Rajinder, and let me find it here. By using your software, how have you saved companies costly production errors?
So I've got, I think, one perfect example. I can't say the company, right? But let's say it was a major bank, and this major bank was releasing a brand new feature that was meant to capture, let's say, the ability to actually add credit card offers to your credit card. So these special offers where you can get discounts on these merchants if you sign up for them when you use your card. So when this feature was first being rolled out, one of the first things that happened is thankfully I had started using this capability. So they said, first, let's test it for mobile users. And we're going to roll it out to 5% of users. When they rolled it out to 5% of users, everything looked great. The next thing that they did is saying, okay, awesome, everything looks good. On the following day, they rolled it out to 10% of users. They started seeing a spike in errors, just timeouts and increase in 500s and 400s. And then they said, okay, hold on, so here's the problem. The beauty of it is that we saw it immediately and the alerts fired off after they set up these metrics. So they were able to immediately roll back to 5%. And this happened within seconds of identifying the issue and seeing the problem. So what we did is once we rolled it back to 5%, let's go dig through the logs, see what's going on. And we realized that there were two things happening. There was something specific about Android users, and secondly, something about the infrastructure itself, the hardware and the gateway that connected us to the vendor supplier for these offers. After we worked with the vendor, they tweaked it. They said, yep, we've improved it. We fixed it. We figured out the issue. We figured out the thing that was going on Android. We said, okay, great. Take two. But we kept Android at 5% because we knew it was having an issue. And I said, let's roll out iOS to 10%. We rolled out iOS to 10%. Everything looked good. Said, well, let's keep Android where it is because we're trying to still figure out a new deployment for Android, but let's roll out iOS to now to 25%. Everything looked good. At that point, we got the Android release, still again, and the fix still at 5%. So let's roll that up to 10%. Okay, everything looks good. Awesome. We fixed the Android issue. We rolled it up to 25%. Now we're at parity with iOS. Everything looked good. When we took both and rolled them out to 50%, again, errors started flaring left and right. Alerts started going off within Split on our operational metrics. So we rolled it back to 25% and said, okay, let's figure out what happened now. Again, we went back to the vendor and we found out there was another configuration issue in their infrastructure on their APIs. After they tweaked that and fixed it, said we're ready again. We said, let's go a little more slowly. We went from 25 to 30, from 30 to 35, and then rolled all the way to 50. Everything looked good. Said, let's take it to 75. Now we're getting almost a full brunt of all the production traffic. And again, this was a very big bank, but no issues. And the issues stay slowly. So they said, great. We made the call at the end of that week. Let's roll out to 100. If anything goes back, we can always roll back. We rolled it to 100 and everything looked good. So I think that was a very great example of how you save yourself in production when rolling out in very controlled fashion, setting your monitoring, alerting, and the ability to granularly change who sees what and when to give you that breathing room ability to fix problems. But again, the ability to quickly see the issue, see the alerts, and then off of that roll back, it's unbelievably powerful.
That's a great customer story. That's great. Hey, one question I wanted to ask about was, revert buttons and sort of your attitude toward those. And so you showed sort of the screenshot with and you could see that kill button there where you could kill the change. Is it a good idea to always kill the change when there's a problem, or sometimes is it good to sort of let it run and get more telemetry or see what you can do?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is this, right? Especially when it comes to experimentation. I'm going to talk about the what we've done to improve this on the monitoring and alerting side. So for monitoring and alerting, we apply a particular statistical technique that allows you to trust the number as it looks right now. And we'll talk about what that means in experimentation. But if you see a number and our alert goes off and says, yes, this feature right now is causing this error, we can tell you for sure if this feature is causing this issue or it's having this unintended impact. The question for you is then, what state were you in before, right? Do you want to go all the way back to zero and kill it completely, or do you want to roll back to the last known good state? And that's always, I think, a balancing act between how many people have seen this and interacted with it and now depend on it or expect it versus how big is the problem. I think, if it's a massive problem where everything's on fire and it's really causing massive impact, for example, to your revenues and it's dropping your users, you probably want to kill it as fast as possible and then figure out what to do later rather than wait around and start thinking about what's the right way to roll it back.
Gotcha.
When it comes to then, the other key thing about experimentation in particular is that, there's this question, especially when you're running two-sided t-tests, which is what we currently do at Split. You need enough time for that feature to get enough users and get enough traffic for the experimental results to be valid. So often, we're very excited about let's peak, let's look at the numbers. The metrics might be off and the impact might say, yes, this has an impact, but you haven't given it enough time to actually be statistically significant and be a valid result. So if you peak early and it tells you this is a winner or this is a loser and this is causing issues, you might make a decision on faulty data. And that's where maybe you don't want to kill immediately. You want to wait for the review period to be over which could be 7 days, could be 14 days. Obviously, you apply that more when you start looking at, you know, when you have things that you have a longer time to wait for, you have metrics that you're trying to understand. Is it having the right impact that we expect on revenue? Is it affecting other things? So you have more time to wait for those. Wait till the end of it. But if it's something that you have an alert on and a monitor on, and it's unbelievably critical and crucial for the business, I lean on the side of kill it immediately or roll back to the last known good state.
Great wisdom there. Appreciate that. We had a question from Chris, who's wondered about, does Split work with legacy systems or applications? And that's a good place to point out that both Emma, Ariel's colleague, and I, we both posted links there in your Q&A chat to the integrations list. So I think
Awesome.
that might answer the question, but I don't know if there's anything else you
Potentially.
want to
Well,
say about that.
yeah, I would also add the link to all our SDKs, right, on different versions. I mean, it's interesting to think about what do we mean by legacy. We've been building software now for long enough that the question is, well, your legacy might not be my legacy. We have the SDK works for any system that supports one of our languages. And we also have a capability for those languages that we do not support. And again, we have a bunch of them. We have, as I said before, JavaScript, iOS, Android, and Kotlin and Swift there, Java, PHP, Ruby, Python, and we recently released a new one. I'm trying to remember, Flutter. So we have all different kinds of SDKs. We support those natively and directly, but also for those that don't, we have what's called the Split Synchronizer, and you can always use us and from your app call us as an API. So for those languages that we currently do not support, I saw some people asking about Rust at some point not too long ago. You can always run us as an API inside your own systems and connect to it to get Split working for you. Obviously, it changes the way you use it, but it works for you. So my answer is yes. Any legacy system should be able to use it. And again, feature flagging, testing and production, experimentation is not even just a problem about building new software. It's actually key and critical when you're testing existing software, regardless of how old it is. So starting to implement these practices actually can benefit you immensely, even in legacy systems.
Okay, and I apologize. I'm posting that link to the languages also in the Q&A chat that Ariel just mentioned. So Ariel, I love this topic. I could ask you questions all day about this. I wish we had more time, but we're almost up against the top of the hour. Any recommendations as far as if people want to get started? I know there are a lot of resources in the handouts. Anything that you'd really recommend they start with?
I think going to split.io and looking at our feature flagging tools. I mean, Split actually has a free version of it, right? You can always start on it on a free package for it. For feature flags, it'll always be free, right? So you can always start diving in and start testing and validating, how well you can work with feature flags. And then, of course, as you grow in the number of users, the number of people, and the capabilities you need out of it, then we have higher and higher tiers. I think as I went through before, right? You can go really far with just feature flags and get a lot of value, but to really accelerate that cycle and get to the point where you really get value immediately and you can respond immediately to issues and challenges, the feature flags and data are the things that are really critical. So go to Split, you can install it, you can set it up, you can run it, set up your account, and start playing with feature flags and seeing how it works for you. The other thing that I would suggest is also start thinking about, what are the metrics that matter? What are the things that, if you were to start testing in production, even if you don't have feature flags, what are the things you would want to start monitoring and paying attention to, and the things you never want to go south, right? Those might be different for your business versus another business. So coming up with those really helps guide you and direct you as anything you roll out and produce. What am I going to be looking for when it's in production, right? Start practicing testing in production. Start practicing observing and monitoring and paying attention to what's happening in production so you can leverage it to its fullest extent.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think you've made a great case for testing in production. And really appreciate you coming on today and bringing us up to speed on Split.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. So finally, it is time for the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of our gift card today is Carlos Vidal from Puerto Rico. So congratulations to Carlos. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Split for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.